Okay, so we're running live. Today we're going to be talking more about animal ethics, and in particular, we'll be talking about Ben Bramble's paper, The Case Against Meat. So let's go ahead and get started. Again, hopefully everybody's doing well, and happy Tuesday. Okay, so we're dealing with Ben Bramble's paper, The Case Against Meat. We've been familiarized a bit with Bramble as he discussed the experience machine in his paper titled The Experience Machine that we discussed a couple weeks ago. So this is continuing on. We talked about Belshaw, who was in the pro-meat or arguing for the pro-meat side last week. The Bramble is, well, pretty straightforward. It's going to be an anti-meat argument. So he considers what he calls the RKF argument. Let's have a look at the PDF here of his paper. So in as much as Belshaw seemed maybe a bit less straightforward and oftentimes difficult to follow, at least in some places, Bramble seems like he's very straightforward right from the get-go in his paper, and his papers just generally, the way he writes and presents his arguments. So he sets off in his paper with the argument. There's a simple but powerful argument against the human practice of raising and killing animals for food, RKF for short. So RKF standing for raising and killing animals for food. It goes like this. 1, RKF for raising and killing animals for food is extremely bad for animals. 2, RKF is only trivially good for human beings. So 3, RKF should be stopped. He calls this argument the case against meat. And so he basically deals with this entire argument the whole time. He doesn't deviate from it. So we're going to be talking about the RKF argument this time. We just read it together. I just presented on this slide again. RKF is extremely bad for animals. RKF is only trivially good for us as human beings. Therefore, RKF should be stopped. Okay, or we should stop raising and killing animals for food. And this last point on the slide is just that terminological point that was already identified. Okay. So objections to the argument. So what Bramble likes to do, or at least what he does in this paper, he does this in other places as well, is he'll present an argument and then he'll defend the argument by considering all the reasonable or apparently reasonable objections or arguments to the contrary. So there are different ways that one could go in responding to the argument, as Bramble notes. Challenge premise 1, challenge premise 2. And if we were to do those things, that amounts to claiming that RKF, raising and killing animals for food, is not extremely bad for animals, or denying the claim that raising and killing animals for food is only trivially good for human beings. So that's what those challenges would amount to. And then 3, animal welfare is relatively unimportant. So even if it's true that RKF is extremely bad for animals, animal welfare isn't insignificant anyways. So we can't then arrive at the conclusion 3 that RKF should be stopped. And then the last objection involves thinking about the claim that individuals by themselves can't make a difference with respect to RKF, can't make a difference with respect to the raising and killing animals for food. That has something to do with the fact that our current procedures, our current practices for raising and killing animals for food, they're big agribusiness in many cases, and so, or by and large they are. So as an individual, we can't make a difference with respect to the RKF practices. So what we're going to do this time is try to focus a little bit, because if we were to try to do all of these in one sitting, I think it'd be quite a bit to go through. And so I want to do some careful unpacking in places. So we're going to focus on number 1, and then we'll do 2, 3, and 4 next time. And this mirrors the way Bramble writes his paper. He spends the majority of his discussion on dealing with premise 1 and challenges to premise 1 and responding to those. Okay. So we'll focus on just objections to premise 1 this time. Okay, so let's just go through the objections and the counter objections, or the responses by Bramble to them. So feel free at any point to interject with any questions or comments as we're moving along here, if anything's not making sense. So what I'm going to go ahead and do with the various objections to premise 1 and throughout our discussion next time is I'm just going to provide tags for the objections, so that way we can easily refer to them if we want to. So this is not something that Bramble does in his piece, but we can do it. Why not? So I'll call the first objection the giving existence objection. And I'll just frequently have a parenthetical where I note that the tag or the label for the objection is ours. Okay, so a way of thinking about the giving existence objection is RKF, raising and killing animals for food, is good for the animals because it gives them existence, which is better than non-existence. Okay. So sometimes in the literature, this line of argument has been called the replaceability argument. So the idea is like all things being equal, it's good to bring animals, it's good to raise and kill animals for food, because by doing so, we actually bring animals into existence. They can have good experiences by and large, or whatever. You might build more into the argument than that. And then the idea is once we've killed them and can then consume them, we can replace them with other animals who we bring into existence. So we bring animals into existence that otherwise wouldn't exist. And all things being equal, that's good. It's good for the animals. Okay, so keep in mind that when we're dealing with premise 1, maybe this is just worth emphasizing before we look at that passage I have noted. Premise 1 of the argument is a claim about what's bad for animals. So we're going to be dealing with the claim about what's good and or bad for animals. It's not until we get to the second premise that we're concerned with what's good for human beings. Okay, so that'll be the focus moving forward. So let's look at the Leslie Stevens passage because it's a famous one. You'll find this in the Bramble early on. So here I'm just, if you've read this, it's really straightforward. You see I'm following him pretty carefully. First premise here. Here's the passage by Leslie Stephen that you'll see cited in many places. So the pig has a stronger interest than anyone in the demand for bacon. If all the world were Jewish, there would be no pigs at all. So of course he's, in running this argument, he's got a little rhetorical flourish of this claim about if all the world were Jewish, there'd be no pigs at all, for obvious reasons, I think. So, so this is, a statement of something like, it being good for pigs that people raise pigs for food. We kill the pigs before we consume them. So this claim about the pig having interest in suggests that it's good for the pig. That pig is raised and killed for food because it's brought into existence in the first place. Okay. So with that in mind, I think we can understand perhaps this, the way we've formulated the objection here. RKF, raising and killing food. Killing animals for food is good for the animals because it gives them existence, like in the first place, which is better than non-existence, or better than not existing. But Bramble doesn't think that that this argument's a good one. So big picture, he claims that something having existence um, isn't better for it than not having existence. I left a 4 out there, if I'm right. Something having existence isn't better for it than not having existence. So the main argument for this resistance to the objection by Bramble is captured in this passage here that I just note. So comparison here requires having well-being in both scenarios, and this requirement isn't satisfied. Okay, so what are the scenarios here that are relevant? Well, the first scenario is a scenario of existing. The second scenario is not existing. And what Bramble claims is that we can compare, right, these two and say that one, right, state is better than the other, right, only if, so this is a necessary, this was a requirement, right, only if there can be well-being in both of these scenarios. And what Bramble claims is that, and this seems initially plausible, I think, that one can only have well-being when one exists. So to have well-being levels requires existing. So if you're in a state of, so if something, to use the dummy noun there, if something is not existing, then it has no state of well-being. So I say the dummy noun something there because presumably I'm not referring to anything because there are no such thing as non-existent things. As you can imagine, there are debates about these issues in philosophy, but Bramble and others believe that it seems like it's pretty safe to say that there are no non-existing things. It's just what it means to not exist. Is that you aren't, that those things aren't. It's just language might mislead us because we say things like, you know, something not existing. It seems like we're referring to something when we do that, but something is, again, could be just used as a dummy noun, doesn't have any reference to anything. It's just to provide us with grammaticality when we're speaking. At least that's one way of going, thinking about what this something means in those kinds of sentences. So it doesn't make sense to compare well-being levels of something that has existence and something that doesn't have existence. So the comparison just isn't available for us. So then there's a attempt at a counter response here. Let me see what I have on the next slide really quickly. Yeah, I get to the next objection. So let's get back here to the alleged Cinderella counterexample and response. So there's some who might want to push back against Bramble here, and he recognizes them and has just a kind of quick response to them. So let's see what it is. So if you look on page 136, right after where we were just before discussing the Leslie Stephen passage, this is the counter objection. So we've got, I think, Bramble's initial objection to the objection to the existence objection, or the bringing into existence objection. But then there's pushback here. It may be objected that non-existent beings can be well or poorly off. Cinderella, for example, does not exist. The thought there is Cinderella is a fictional character. And so just by definition, Cinderella doesn't exist. But she was poorly off until she met her fairy godmother. So the thought would be something like, well, Cinderella doesn't exist, but it seems true to say, wouldn't it, that Cinderella is poorly off, right, until she met her fairy godmother. And there's different ways of dealing with this kind of issue, as you can imagine. And there are debates actually about whether or not fictional characters exist. So whether or not, like, Sherlock Holmes exists and Cinderella exists. So we needn't venture into those debates. But many would argue that they're fictional characters, they're being fictional characters, excuse me, implies that they don't exist because they're fictional, right? So anyways, what Bramble says in order to respond to this, because it does seem true to say that Cinderella was, poorly off until she met her fairy godmother. Bramble wants to explain that away. And what he says is, but when we talk about Cinderella, we're not saying there is some woman who had evil stepsisters, rode to a ball in a pumpkin, fell in love with the prince, and had a level of welfare, and so on. We're saying precisely that there is no such woman. She's a fictional character after all. When we say that Cinderella was poorly off until she met her fairy godmother, we are saying that if there had been such a woman, it's almost as if like it's implicit in the context in which we would say that Cinderella was poorly off until she met her fairy godmother, that if there had been such a woman as Cinderella, as a fictional character, a woman fitting these descriptions, then this woman would have been poorly off until she met her fairy godmother. So that's one way of dealing with these problems, right? Cinderella being a fictional character, again, just to review, because I do think this is a bit abstract when you first think about it. But it does seem true to say of Cinderella that she was poorly off until she met her fairy godmother. So how do we deal with that, that true claim about her? And the way Bramble deals with this is just to say that what we mean when we say that is something like, if there had been someone who meets the descriptions that Cinderella, a fictional character, has, right, in the fictional work Cinderella, then that woman, the one that would have existed, had she satisfied these descriptions, would have been poorly off until she met her fairy godmother. Other people think that what's going on in those contexts is like there's something else. It's not, if there had been someone who met the descriptions of Cinderella that Cinderella has in the fiction, blah blah blah, they'd say something like, what we mean is something like, in the fiction, Cinderella was poorly off until she met her fairy godmother. So there are these kinds of ways of dealing semantically with claims like Cinderella, the apparently true claims, right, that Cinderella was poorly off until she met her fairy godmother. Okay, so Bramble, he does want to consider, someone who would want to try to say that non-existing beings like Cinderella could have levels of well-being. He wants to deal with, right? He wants to deal with those responses and say that they still fell. Okay, so that's the significance of the Cinderella counterexample. Okay. So some of this stuff about fictional characters is pretty abstract, but hopefully I've made the point clear. If I haven't, feel free to let me know if I can say more to help. Okay, so Bramble continues and he says, well, so suppose all this is granted, suppose his opponent, with respect to that first premise, who's objecting to the first premise of the RKF argument, right, is satisfied and is willing to move on, wants to develop another objection, well, considers what we'll call the parity objection. Okay, so we've got the giving existence objection or the coming into existence question, and now we've got the parity objection. So suppose, this is just to capture the spirit of the objection, suppose having an existence isn't good for one, right? Suppose that ends up being granted, then having existence also isn't bad for one. So that's why I call it the parity objection, because it's saying that there's parity holding between having existence, right, not being good for an individual. Well, then it follows from that, according to the objection, that by parity, that then having existence isn't bad for the individual that has existence. So while RKF isn't good for animals, it also isn't bad for them. Okay. So remember, the argument for RKF being good for animals was that animals are brought into existence. They're given existence when they otherwise wouldn't have been. And that claim is supported by having existence is better than not having existence. And that was challenged, remember? So then that's sort of bracketed and assumed, and then we move forward and develop a new objection here. Okay, so again, so while RKF, raising and killing animals for food, isn't good for animals, it also isn't bad for them. And that's important, right? Just to make sure we're remembering where we're at here, because there's a lot going on, is that would challenge the first premise, right? RKF is claiming it's extremely bad for animals. RKF is extremely bad for animals. And then, right, the conclusion of this parity objection is that RKF isn't bad for animals. So it's also then, right, presumably not extremely bad for them. Okay, so what Bramble does from here is this, let's compare. Let's think about these two claims here related to RKF. So he says there's two parts of RKF. One, RKF bringing animals into existence, and then two, RKF involving the treatment of animals in a certain way. RKF involves treating animals in a certain way. Okay. So we raise and kill animals for food, and of course we bring animals into existence in doing so. So that first part of RKF is pretty straightforward. But the second part is too, isn't it? So when we raise and kill animals for food, we're going to do so in a way that involves treating them in certain ways. And Bramble claims that two is the issue here. We've already dealt really with the first point before, thinking about the first objection and then the responses to the first objection. So two is the issue now. RKF is bad for animals, Bramble claims, because it gives the animals brought into existence worse lives than they might otherwise have had. So we bring animals into existence, we raise them, we kill them for food. We could bring them into existence without raising them and killing them for food. And so the idea is that when we bring animals into existence for the sake of raising them and killing them for food, we give them worse lives than they otherwise would have had if we weren't raising them and killing them for food. If you think about it, there are all kinds of reasons we might want to bring animals into existence. One such reason involves raising and killing them for food. One dominant reason, of course, is that, isn't it? But there are others that we have and that we could have even. And it's important to know here that this point, according to Bramble, holds for both factory and free-range farming. So I try to give a sense of what factory farming was last time. Bramble gives a description of it in his paper. I think I've given one as well. Mine, I think, is pretty close to his. So if we go on page 137 here, he says, so defender of the RKF argument may object that I'm assuming that RKF involves factory farming, that is farming which animals are raised in cramped spaces, caused to feel much pain during their lives, and killed in a brutal manner. So he gives a really quick description of factory farming there. There's, of course, a lot more that could be said, but that's the way he initially describes it. Maybe the only way in which he describes it in his paper, if I'm right. But then he goes on to say that his counter reply to the second objection, to the parity objection, it applies to not just factory farming, but to free-range farming. Okay. So he describes free-range farming as a kind of farming that gives the animals in questions, by and large, happy lives, where they're not living in cramped spaces, they're not caused to feel much pain during their lives, and they're not killed in a brutal manner. Okay. So just to say a bit more here, so we're clear as to what's going on here. So factory farming, RKF, so there's different ways in which we can raise and kill animals for food. One way is factory farming. And according to Bramble, RKF, factory farming RKF, gives animals worse lives than they otherwise would have. That seems like it's pretty straightforward, because we could give them free range right? RKF, we can give them free range lives if we wanted to, if we were so inclined. But Bramble claims that he is not assuming that RKF is really bad for is really bad only for factory farmed animals. It say it could be bad for, could be really bad for free range animals as well. So in cases of free range RKF, so just the opposite of the factory farming RKF, RKF is bad for them because free range animals live shorter lives than they would otherwise. So we might bring animals into existence for the sake of raising and killing them for food. We are going to do so on free range farms. What Bramble is claiming here is that RKF could still be really bad for these free range animals because, and what's going to account, excuse me, for that, that extreme badness is the fact that free range animals are going to live shorter lives than they otherwise would. So it might be that the case of factory farming RKF, that's a clear case, like where we'd say that that we're giving them worse lives than we could. And you just think about the alternative, you put them in free range, you put them on free range farms, excuse me, and that seems like the natural thing to say in response to thinking about factory farming RKF. But then Bramble wants to say even putting them on free range farms isn't enough to challenge the claim that the RKF is extremely bad for the animals that are on them. And so what's going to explain this, the fact that free range RKF is still bad for the animals, again, it's just this claim here that free range animals will live shorter lives than they would otherwise. So there might be many who when they think about meat eating, they think, gosh, I should give up factory farm food. Animals live terrible lives. And so they move away from consuming the vast majority of animal products that are on the market nowadays. And they will go to Whole Foods or other places where they know that free range animal products are sold and provided them. But Bramble would want to say that not so fast, that's still going to be problematic. And this is at least part of the explanation why it's problematic. Okay, so now we're ready to segue to another objection. So this will be what we'll call the desire condition objection. Again, our tag. And the basic idea is going to be longer lives on free range farms aren't better for farm animals. Okay, so now we're just kind of focusing on the free range farms. Bramble's assuming that we can agree that the lives that animals live on factory farms would be far worse than they otherwise would be. I hope I said factory farms there. The lives that animals live on factory farms, they're going to be far worse than they otherwise would be. So then now, at least for the rest of thinking about premise one, Bramble's really thinking just about the free range farms, animals living on free range farms. And he's even assuming that when animals live on free range farms, that they live happy lives while they're on the free range farms, and that they're killed painlessly in their sleep. So they're not expecting some death to come their way. It just happens in their sleep without them realizing it. So that's sort of another thing to kind of build in to the discussion moving forward as we continue discussing this first premise and objections to it, and then obviously Bramble's responses to those objections. So now we're moving on to the desire condition objection. Longer lives on free range farms aren't better for farm animals is a claim. And of course, that's what would have to be said, right? Just given the way the conversation is going here. Was explaining why RKF is bad for free range animals, as the fact that they're living shorter lives than otherwise would. So then this objection is going to try to target that claim, that counterclaim by Bramble, and to flesh out the objection here in argument form. I just note here on the slide, longer lives are better for such animals only if, so we have a requirement here, necessary condition, only if they have desires to live longer or otherwise have long-term plans, projects, or goals. They don't, however, satisfy this condition. The animals, that is, on free-range farms. All right, so so the parenthetical, just to maybe flesh it out here a little bit, I think we know what we mean have a desire to live longer. We talked a bit about this with the bell shot last time, but this bit about there's parenthetical that claims that or expands the requirement to include having long-term plans, projects, or goals. The thought would be that it may be that that animals on free-range farms don't have desires to live longer, like specifically, but they could have long-term plans, projects, or goals which they would want to have fulfilled. And so, according to the objection, even if it turns out that it's too restrictive to say that that animals have to, these free-range animals have to have desires to live longer in order for their longer lives to matter to them in terms of their well-being, right? We could include these robust desires as well. The idea, I guess, being something like long-term plans would involve having desires, projects, having projects, but it would include having certain desires that the project be completed, and having goals. Goals might be a kind of subset of the desires that we have. And so this might, you might think that like there's at any given time a range of desires that an animal or even a human being has. And a subset of those desires are ones that are taken up for attempted fulfillment. So, you might have the desire to take a nap, you might have it right now or just before class begins. But you discount that and you take up the goal of coming to Zoom lecture today or something like that. You take that as your goal, not the goal to, find a place for yourself to take a nap. Okay, so the desire condition objection really just involves claiming that, longer lives are going to be better for these free-range farm animals, right? Only if they have robust desires. One of those desires may be may include having a desire for continued existence, but needn't involve that. That's the significance of the parenthetical. And again, just following Bramble here. So that's the challenge. Response by Bramble. Well, even if animals do satisfy the condition, it doesn't matter. There's a deeper problem with the objection. So there's some actually out there who dig in their heels and say that animals do desire to live longer. They do have long-term plans to some degree. They have projects. They do have goals. Okay. So there are those out there who would maintain that. And I think I've anticipated at least one line of support for the claim that animals desire to live longer by thinking about cases where animals know that they're going to be slaughtered, or animals are in line to be slaughtered and they try to get away from the slaughterer, or the person who's going to be inflicting the slaughter on them. Okay. Okay, but Bramble says, no worries. He's like, it's not really the right kind of response anyway to the objection. So he says there's a deeper problem with it. So the deeper problems going to involve that it contentiously assumes a desire satisfaction theory of well-being. So remember, it's the desire condition objection. So what's going to be significant to longer life being better in terms of well-being for these free-range animals is going to be the fact they have certain desires satisfied. So we're talking about betterness in terms of better for the farm animals. So we're talking about well-being here. talking about what's intrinsically good, aren't we, for these free range farm animals? So we're talking about well-being, and so this is putting a desire satisfaction condition on well-being for the free range farm animals here. So again, this objection is going to contentiously assume a desire satisfaction theory of well-being as being the correct theory of well-being, and Bramble's response ultimately is going to branch into two different challenges to it. So what we're going to have to do here is just a bit of a sidebar. So I want to make sure that we're clear on desire satisfactionism. We have said some things about desire satisfactionism so far, but we're talking here about desire satisfactionism as a theory of well-being. Sometimes this view is called desire theory of well-being, desire theory of welfare. Sometimes it's called desire fulfillment theory. So you're going to see it called different things in the literature. Let's just get clear on what it is and build up to Bramble's reply again to the desire condition. Okay, objection. So the well-being of an individual is determined by the satisfaction of desires. There's no surprise there. A way of putting this, a way of fleshing this out is in the following: all things being equal, an individual's well-being increases with the satisfaction of desires, and it decreases with the frustration of desires, or the thwarting of desires. Some such would work. So desires being satisfied are the fundamental units of well-being, and desire frustration, desires not being satisfied, are the basic units of unwell-being, life going worse for the individual in question. Okay, so you may recall that desire satisfactionism, it is a monistic theory of well-being, because it's claiming to be the one thing that accounts for the well-being of the individual in question. And it's also subjectivist, because at least traditionally it's subjectivist. There are different ways of going, but desire satisfactionism is dominantly subjectivist in terms of its formulation, meaning that what's going to turn out to be good for someone in terms of their well-being is going to be something subjectively determined, something that they subjectively desire. So someone out there who's a well-known desire satisfactionist, I just kind of wanted to give you a sample of someone who's in that tradition. His name is Heathwood, Chris Heathwood, University of Colorado Boulder, I believe currently. He wrote this paper. Get you to the top. I want to get to back to page 4 in a second here, but he wrote this paper. He's readily available online. So if you're interested in reading Faring Well and Getting What You Want, this gives a nice introduction to desire satisfactionism. He lays out what desire satisfactionism is after situating it in the context of thinking about theories of well-being, or as he calls it, theories of welfare, and describes it as a subjectivist view dominantly, and then goes from there. But it's a really accessible paper, both in terms of finding it online, but also in terms of reading it, because he gives lots of really good examples. So in order to kind of motivate the subjectivism point, he gives us this case of Charlie. So he says, in talking about subjectivism, he says, subjectivist about well-being hold that something we get in life benefits us when and only when we have an interest in it or want it. Think about desire there, or have some other positive attitude towards it. It causes us to get something else that we have, or we'll have a positive attitude toward it. And then the contrast view is objectivism. Objectivists about welfare deny this and maintain that at least some of the intrinsically beneficial things, some of the intrinsically good things in our lives are good for us. we're talking about well-being here, if we don't want them, or sorry, even if we don't want them, don't like them, or don't care about them, and even if they fail to get us anything else that we want or care about, they're good for us, quote unquote, whether we like it or not. So we've talked about subjectivism. Objectivism, I just thought that'd be worthwhile to give a little bit of a recap on that. This was a couple weeks ago, and sometimes these are abstract at first and take a little bit of time before they settle in, these ways of carving up theories of well-being within a value theory. So he goes on to say, if I'm right about this, that this is a truth about welfare, well-being for our purposes, namely subjectivism is true, I think that is probably a foundational truth. That means that there's no deeper truth about welfare from which we can derive it and hence argue for it, but there are still considerations that can help us see it. Right? So there's no knockdown argument for subjectivism, but he thinks that there are concrete cases that he can develop thought experiments that can help us that can help us see that subjectivism is true. Okay, and of course, you can imagine there's debates about whether or not these cases are successful, but here we go. The case of Charlie. Charlie wants to improve his quality of life. He has heard that it is philosophers who claim to be experts on this topic. So he looks through some philosophy journals at his library. He finds an article claiming to have discovered the correct account of welfare, the correct account of well-being. It is an objective theory that includes the items on our list above. So on the list above, we have things like pleasure, happiness, knowledge, friendship, the enjoyment of beauty, freedom, these kinds of things, justice. So it's an objective theory that includes the items on our list above. The paper is a pretty good journal, so Charlie decides to go about trying to increase his share of some of the items on the list. For example, to increase his freedom. So Heathwood just challenges the freedom, the objective good of freedom, the quote unquote objective good and freedom to develop this case with Charlie. He moves to a state with higher speed limits. Charlie's careful to make sure that the move won't make any detrimental side effect or won't have any detrimental side effects, that it won't cause him to fail to get any less of the other goods on the list. Okay, so think about those other things that we have on the list. They'll all be held fixed and constant as Charlie moves to another state, which will allow him the freedom of driving faster on the interstates. After succeeding in increasing his freedom, Charlie finds he doesn't care about it, that he's completely indifferent to it. Although he is free to drive faster, he never does, he never wants to, nor does the freedom to drive faster get him anything else that he's interested in. Charlie considers whether he's any better off as a result of the increase in his freedom. He concludes that he is not better off, or that he is no better off. And then Heathwood goes on to say that he agrees with Charlie's assessment of the situation when he claims that, he's no better off. Now, of course, freedom was chosen arbitrarily because we could have chosen, justice, or we could have chosen appreciating beauty. We could have chosen all manner of things, revised the case in the relevant kinds of ways, and whatever quote unquote objective good that's been considered in the case is not cared about. It doesn't seem like it contributes positively to Charlie's well-being. So the thought experiment result here is supposed to be, if correct, that subjectivism is true. Caring about something is what, or taking interest in something, or desiring it is significant or essential to the relevant good in question, contributing to one's well-being. Okay, so desire satisfactionism fits traditionally in the subjectivist tradition. We're going to see that that there's some ways of developing it in a more objectivist ways in a moment. So there are challenges to desire satisfactionism, or at least the traditional versions, of desire satisfactionism. So we've anticipated pointless desires and bad desires, as you may recall. So Bramble, he footnotes John Rawls here, who gives us examples of both. The pointless desires objection to desire satisfactionism involves someone who has a desire to count every blade of grass in his backyard. Once that desire is satisfied, the desire satisfactionist has to claim, that was intrinsically good for the person who had that desire satisfied. But the intuition is supposed to be that given that the desire was so pointless, that it wasn't intrinsically good for that individual. So it's a kind of like, intuition that's elicited from thinking about cases involving people having pointless desires satisfied. Likewise, people could have murderous desires, bad desires. So in those cases, when someone has a bad desire satisfied, um, many people want to say that that's not intrinsically good for the person. You might be wondering what kind of bad desires seem relevant or most easy to see as leading to problems for the view. And that's where we get the Ted Bundy case. Heathwood mentions it in his discussion of desire satisfactionism in the paper that I've mentioned and read from just a moment ago. Go back to that paper. He says, but the objection may be most forceful, the objection to desire satisfactionism, or really the challenge to subjectivism, but we can understand it in terms of thinking about desire satisfactionism. So at this stage in the paper, he's still dealing with the subjectivism bit, and then he moves on to the desire satisfaction view. But insofar as the desire satisfactionism is subjectivist, this would be a challenge to desire satisfactionism because it's a challenge to subjectivism. So, the objection that may be most forceful, the problem with bad desires, when it appeals to pursuits that are positively bad. Consider, to take a real life example, the serial rapist and murderer Ted Bundy. If you haven't heard of him, well, he's described here correctly as being a serial rapist and murderer. There's been, there have been many documentaries, forensic file type shows that describe the life of Ted Bundy, and they're very horrific. What Bundy wanted most in his life was to inflict pain on innocent strangers, to wield power over them, and to watch them beg, suffer, and die at his own hand. For quite a number of years, Bundy got just what he wanted. According to subjectivism, when it comes to welfare, anything you take an interest in is as good as any other. That is, it doesn't matter what you want, so long as you get it. And so long as you're getting it doesn't conflict with your getting other things that you want. Thus, assuming that Bundy wasn't plagued with guilt or regret during his reign of terror, and that he avoided other unwanted side effects of his lifestyle, so subjectivists must say that Bundy benefited greatly in doing what he did, that he's quite well off, at least before he got caught. And then he goes on to say, objectivists, by contrast, have the resources to condemn Bundy's behavior, not just morally, but from the point of view of his own self-interest. Right? They can say that Bundy would himself have been better off if he had and had achieved more admirable goals. Maybe being more just, right? If we include, being virtuous as something that contributes, intrinsically to our well-being levels. Okay, so the subjectivist has to say that Bundy, at least while he was doing what he did, while he was wielding power over others and just inflicting such horror on people, that he was living in such a way that his life was going well for him, that his well-being levels were quite high, all things being equal, during this time of his life. He ends up getting caught and all the rest thereafter, but just thinking about those time periods where he's having his desires satisfied, and his desires, whatever they are, murderous desires, right, as long as they're satisfied, benefited him. Now, what Heathwood goes on to do is he ends up going on to say, look, it's really his immoral behavior that we're locking in on. Bundy acted immorally, and that's what's bad about what Bundy did. But it's not bad for him that his desires were satisfied. So you can have it be true at the same time that Bundy's well-being levels were, through the roof while he was engaging in this murderous behavior, having his murderous desire satisfied. But he was despicable. He was a moral monster. Those could be equally true, according to someone like Heathwood, who's in the subjectivist camp. Okay, so that's the route that Heathwood goes, but many people find Heathwood's arguments lacking, and so they end up claiming that What we should do instead is go idealize with respect to our desire theory, our desire satisfaction theory. Our actual desires can be pointless, they can be bad, and all the rest. So why don't we develop a different desire view, one that thinks about desires in different ways, one that can avoid the problem of bad desires, pointless desires. So a way of thinking about the idealized desire satisfaction theory is in the following way, just roughly. Initially, an individual's well-being is determined by the satisfaction of idealized desires. And so then what are idealized desires? Okay, I try to define them, at least roughly here, bottom of the slide. Idealized desires are the desires that one would have if one were fully informed, rational, vividly imaginative, and based on a maximally mature version of oneself. Oh, if I'm right, actually, upon rereading the Bramble, he doesn't include rational, right? So let me get rid of that. Some will build in rational, and I just instinctively put in the rational, so let's get rid of that. So I think, if I'm right, Bramble, yeah, he focuses on just being fully informed, vividly imaginative, and the maximally mature version of oneself. Okay, those are going to be idealized desires. Okay. So it's the desires that one would have. Okay, were they better than they actually are? Right, in these ways that are noted on the slide here. Okay. So knowing all the relevant facts, that's what it means to be fully informed, being vividly imaginative, and having desires that are based on a mature version of oneself. Okay. So this is a route that many desire satisfaction theorists go. And one of the things that's is claimed by Heathwood and others when philosophers go this route, they end up claiming that that this goes against the subjectivism that desire satisfaction theorists typically want. So desire satisfaction theory that focuses on just our actual desires, that's going to end up being subjectivist. But then when philosophers develop idealized versions of desire satisfaction theory, then those theories, at least Heathwood and others claim, those theories are objectivist. Or at least they tend toward objectivism as ways of resolving the problem of bad desires, pointless desires, and or just the problem of bad subjective states, if we're just thinking about subjectivism more generally as the correct theory of well-being, without it being properly precisified into the various ways in which one could be a subjectivist. So now so just back to the Bramble here, because we did a little sidebar where I just wanted to get clear on what desire satisfaction theory was, because the desire desire condition objection that we're thinking about here, it's going to be problematic according to Bramble because it presupposes desire satisfaction theory. Well, what's desire satisfaction theory? So we got clear on that, or we got refreshed on that. And then there's this important move to idealize desire theory or desire satisfaction theory that was important because Bramble is going to focus on that version of the theory. So back to the response, recall that the objection Bramble's dealing with is that since animals lack desires for continued living or for other plans, projects, or goals to be fulfilled, then longer lives, even on free-range farms, where animals are going to they're going to be killed painlessly in their sleep, remember, are not better for them than the shorter ones. Okay. So the necessary condition, right, necessary desire condition, as we've been discussing, hasn't been satisfied. So the response by Bramble, as I noted, was going to be twofold. So Bramble claims that there are two main problems with assuming desire theory of well-being. And the first problem is captured here. Idealized theories are preferable to their counterparts. So he's willing to say that those who endorse a kind of subjectivism where actual desires are all that matter in the desire satisfaction theory, that those theories fail. And so the better, more preferable desire satisfaction theories are the idealized versions. So that's the reason why I went to lengths I did to explain the idealized view. Um, but then there's no reason to think that free range animals won't meet the desired condition for longer lives be better than shorter ones, right? Or for any of the other conditions to be satisfied, because these animals then we could understand as having more robust desires, because we're thinking about more fully informed animals who have, you know, better, more robust psychologies, right? In the abstract, when we think about those scenarios where we're thinking about idealized desires that animals, you know, would have. So once we idealize, here's a way of putting the point here. Once the way of putting Bramble's counter, I should say, to the objection here is that once we idealize the desires, even of these free range farm animals, we're making them robust enough to satisfy the desired condition. Okay, so that's really, I think, a big picture way of putting what's going on here, right, in this first line of reply that Bramble offers in response to the relevant idealized theories. Okay, and in response to just the desire objection or desire condition objection that we've been talking about. Okay, again, make the desires more idealized. You've made them more robust, and so then the free range farm animals satisfy the desired condition in the first place. So there you go. And then the second reply is that even idealized versions of desire satisfaction theory seem false. So the non-idealized versions seem false. Bramble claims the preferable desire satisfaction theories better, claims Bramble, but they still seem false to him. So what Bramble goes on to say here in response is that it doesn't seem like having our desire satisfied, even idealized desire satisfied, makes a difference with respect to our well-being in the way that desire satisfaction theorists claim. It's rather that pleasant experiences of certain kinds, right, do. So here, Bramble does less arguing against these idealized versions of desire satisfaction theory and more of developing an alternative view. So he claims that it's really pleasant experiences, and emphasis here on of certain kinds. That's why I underlined that expression here, are at the foundation of well-being. So define the phrase pleasant experiences of certain kinds here. Define that in terms of, or as the following: pleasant experiences that are qualitatively new in some way. Or a way I like to think about what Bramble's saying here is that these are pleasant experiences that admit of qualitative diversity. That's the way I would have put the point if I was writing Bramble's paper with his ideas. Okay, so pleasant experiences of certain kinds involve pleasant experiences that are qualitatively new, or in our terminology, you know, for our purposes, that admit of qualitative diversity. Okay. I think that better captures what Bramble has in mind here, but I haven't run any of this by the Bramble. Maybe I should contact him and see what he would say. Contrast the pleasant experiences of certain kinds, or pleasant experiences that are qualitatively diverse, as we put it, with experiences that are purely repeated, or experiences that involve or constituted by purely repeated pleasures. Okay. Now, before looking at the passage that I have noted on the slide from page 139, I just want to just note that Bramble, his view here in responding to desire satisfaction theory, by on the one hand claiming that subjectivist, you know, actual versions of desire versions of desire satisfaction theories are false, and on the other hand that the idealized versions of desire satisfaction theory are false. He's arguing that another theory of well-being is true. Can you see which theory that is? Can you identify what that theory is? Just was giving you a second to think about it. You didn't have to blurt it out or anything. Just wanted to give you a second to think about it on your own even. It's hedonism. Okay, so pleasant experiences, the basis of well-being, the foundations of well-being for Bramble, as it turns out. And that may intrigue you a little bit because we read a paper by Bramble where he talked about the experience machine. And the experience machine involved the attempt to refute hedonism. Okay, so that's all by itself not an issue, it seems. But remember, in the paper, Bramble, he defends the experience machine argument developed by Nozick, remember, against objections to the argument. So he basically seems like he's defending the experience machine argument, which involves the refutation of hedonism. So how is Bramble then a hedonist? Well, what you're thinking about is Bramble could think that that there is a proper response to the experience machine argument. It's just that some of the recent responses, indeed he considers recent responses in his paper, they all fail. So, and in fact, that seems to be what goes on in Bramble. So Bramble is a hedonist. He develops his hedonism in a kind of unique way, and ultimately thinks that that the experience machine argument fails. He ultimately thinks that the experience machine argument cannot replicate, or sorry, he ultimately thinks that the experience machine argument fails because the experience machine itself cannot replicate certain kinds of pleasant experiences that matter to our well-being in a very significant way. That's the gist of his reply to the experience machine argument. So he holds that. All the while, there's a range of other objections to the experience machine argument that Bramble claims fail. Okay, so that's a way of kind of sorting out some of the initial tension here. And I explain this because someone in lecture, someone in class, someone who viewed the lecture and looked up Bramble, recognized that he was a hedonist and asked me to explain how he could be a hedonist, yet have written the paper, The Experience Machine, where he defends objections to Nozick's experience machine argument. And so there you have it. Okay, so let's turn to the Gertie example here. Again, what we're doing here is we're going to look at the difference between experiences, pleasant experiences that admit of this qualitative newness or qualitative diversity, as I like to put it, and these other pleasant experiences that are purely repeated. So let's see if we can build up to it. So we're going to leave the Heathwood and go back to our Bramble. Page 139, I believe, is where I said we were. Yep. Okay. So we'll begin just above. So the Gertie example starts paragraph, the paragraph that carries over to page 140. We'll begin with the only full paragraph on page 139. So as I say, this is Bramble, I see certain kinds of pleasures rather than simply additional pleasures for an important reason. On a view, I'm tempted by purely repeated pleasures, that is, pleasures that introduce nothing qualitatively new in terms of pleasurableness into a being's life, add nothing to that being's lifetime well-being. Okay, so he says, on a view, I'm tempted by a hedonism, a version of hedonism, ultimately, that he's tempted by. Purely repeated pleasures add nothing to that being's lifetime well-being. Any further pleasures involved in a longer life are good for one only if, there's a necessary condition, only if these pleasures bring something qualitatively new in terms of pleasurableness to one's life. Bring something qualitatively new in terms of pleasant experiences to one's life. If all a person gets in having more life is just the same pleasures of watching their favorite sitcom over and over again, then this person has gained nothing by living longer. Okay, again, even if it's pleasant experience after pleasant experience, watching the sitcom over and over and over again brings in pleasant experiences over and over again, that doesn't add anything ultimately to one's lifetime well-being, one's continued living, to one's lifetime overall well-being levels. I could put it that way. It might be the best way of putting it. Similarly, I believe if an animal gets in having more life, if all an animal gets in having more life is just the same pleasures of chewing grass over and over again, then it has gained nothing by living longer. The thing is, however, I believe there is considerable scope for further qualitatively new pleasures in life of a free range animal who is still young or middle aged. My suspicion, indeed, is that many of those who believe that additional life cannot be good for an animal believe this only because they are falsely assuming that the only future pleasures available to cows, pigs, chickens, and the like, those animals that we raise for food commonly, right? Or at least cows, pigs, chickens that have spent some time in a free range farm, are purely repeated ones. Okay, we tend to think that they just live these boring, monotonous lives, getting monotonous pleasures from just repeatedly engaging in the same kinds of experiences. What pleasures do I have in mind? Consider a family dog. Gertie, imagine Gertie running around all day in a local park, chasing sticks, meeting new dogs, having new olfactory pleasures. And we know they get a great deal of pleasure out of sniffing and smelling things and exploring parts of the park she has never been to before. It seems clear to me, and I hope to you, that it was a good thing for Gertie that she lived on until today. If she had died peacefully in her sleep last night, this would have been bad for her, since she would not have lived on to experience all these wonderful, qualitatively new doggy pleasures. Similarly, cows roaming free in a green paddock with plenty to eat, even if they have no future-oriented desires, even if they have no robust desires, right, as we were talking about before, may have evolving social lives with each other that are a source of qualitatively new pleasures for them as time goes by, or slow dawning realizations about their lives, or vague increments in understanding that are pleasurable in various ways, or different or deeper appreciations of the field in which they're grazing at. It undergoes changes during the shifting seasons or experiences of watching their offspring grow into adulthood and reproduce themselves that involve pride or satisfaction. To kill them when they are young or middle aged would be to rob them of these qualitatively new experiences. So you see, Bramble ventures to claim that these animals that live on farms that are free range, they're able to experience qualitatively new or qualitatively diverse pleasures in ways that we might not think. Okay. And we should think that that's true in part because we think it's also true of Gertie. So Gertie's an animal. Presumably that's raised well. Let's just go ahead and assume. Suppose that Gertie were to die or were to be killed, right, in his sleep, right, painlessly. It seems like not having longer life was bad for it because Gertie was going to go out and chase sticks and sniff all around and enjoy some park that Gertie's never been to, or whatever, or some part of a park that Gertie's never been to. Well, if that's the case, then by parity of reasoning, then right, it's bad for these cows, chickens, and pigs on free range farms to not live longer, right, than they otherwise would or otherwise do, even assuming that they're painlessly killed in their sleep. So free range animals, just to put a bone ribbon on this, can experience qualitatively new pleasures even as they age. It would be bad for free range animals to be killed, to have their lives cut short as a result. So it's better for free range animals to live longer lives and shorter ones, even if they are painlessly killed in their sleep while young or middle aged. Okay. Good. So remember, ultimately, when we were talking about the Belshaw, he ended up claiming that when we're morally permitted to kill animals, at the end of the day, we're permitted to, in cases where we give animals relatively short lives to live, we give them all kinds of goodness, right, in their short lives, because they seem to have a lot more fun and seem more interested in their lives, right, as they're young. But once they get older, Belshaw claims, they seem to lose that zest for life, and so it's permitted to kill them before they reach past middle age. right? Before they get old, of course. So, so here, um, uh, we can see how the Belshaw and the Bramble, they dovetail a bit here. But Bramble, he's going to go a bit further. So now we've got a new objection. We're still dealing with that first premise. Remember, that was the whole goal this time. We have the old age objection, again, R tag. So RKF can evolve, allowing free-range animals to live longer lives. So we can raise and kill animals for food, give them longer lives, allow them to live longer, more exactly, let them live until they die of old age, natural causes, and the rest. Right? And then obviously they consume the meat from the animals after they've died of natural causes. So then the argument is, well, so RKF is not necessarily bad for free-range animals. So raising and killing animals for food is not bad, not necessarily bad for free-range animals. Again, even those who we would painlessly kill in their sleep. And of course, if RKF is not necessarily bad for free-range animals, then it's not necessarily extremely bad for free-range animals. Not necessarily bad for animals, the relevant animals. At a certain stage of Bramble's discussion, the focus becomes, remember again, it becomes on the free-range animals. Bramble's reply: such an RKF system would not be bad for free-range animals, but as there's little to no market for it, right? Little to no market for an RFK system that an RKF system, excuse me, that that provides us with meat from old aged animals that died of natural causes in old age, right? This is relatively unimportant. Okay. The idea here is just that it's a common complaint against meat from animals that are old, right? That the meat is tough and tasteless. So there'd be a little market for it, if any. So Bramble goes ahead and claims, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and bite the bullet here and say that if we had an RKF system that focused on allowing animals to live complete lives, die of natural causes, and then we were going to consume the meat after they died of the natural causes in old age, it's not bad for them that we do that. Finally, though, RKF of this kind may be bad for us, even if it's not bad for the free-range animals in question that we're considering. But then here, this is really now our segue to the second premise, and that's really what we'll deal with next time. We'll segue to the second premise and deal with problems also the other two objections that we talked about to begin our discussion today. Just by way of recap, then, we've been dealing with premise one, just so it's totally clear. RKF is really bad for animals or extremely bad for animals. That's the premise. And then we looked at 4 objections to the first premise. So it was pretty, involved and detailed in places. And then we talked about how Bramble responded to each of these objections, and then even counter objections underneath these. So are there any questions or comments, concerns? I think that concludes what I wanted to deal with this time. Okay, so if there aren't any questions, then we'll go ahead and stop here. And I'll wish you all a great night, and I'll see you all on Thursday. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
You take care.